Hello there, and welcome to Pulping the Pulp, the craft show where we reduce, reuse, recycle the world's worst literary productions. Today, we will be taking this utter piece of trash, James Patterson by James Patterson, a true sign of the decline of culture under late capitalism, and turning it into something beautiful and lasting. A papier-mâché skull decorated as a saint's relic. Now, we're making a very simple papier-mâché mixture, so if you're going to follow along with me, you'll need 3/4 cup of warm water, 1 cup of regular school glue, a stir stick. I'm using this plastic spoon because I'm cheap and it came with some fast food, a bowl for your mixture, a balloon to form the skull, and of course, James Patterson by James Patterson. Alright. Now, since when we make the mixture, our hands are going to get a little sticky, the first thing we want to do is tear up the pages. Feels good, doesn't it? Look at us recycling. Bill Nye would be so proud. Take that, capitalism. I mean, if you make a disposable book, then don't be surprised when it gets disposed of. Tear it into nice little strips. These are going to be what we sculpt with. And it's okay to make your strips a little uneven. You're going to need all different kinds for the detailing. So some are nice and wide, and some will be quite thin. Let's mix it up a little bit. All right. Let's go ahead and tear up the part where he talks about how Donald Trump is the best golfer he's ever played with. Won't that make some nice pulp for our arts and crafts? Normally it's recommended that you use newspaper for projects like this because it's a little thinner, since newspapers are printed with the purpose of being largely disposable. But given the content of this damn book, I figured what could be more appropriate. Oh, here's the chapter where he talks about Catholic guilt before proceeding to be utterly shameless for 300 pages. Okay, let's do some shorter strips now. Oh, this is the part where he uses a lot of ableist language to talk about the patients at a mental hospital where he was a guard as a young man. He's willing to tell you all about the writer celebrities that he met when they were at their very worst. And he is using it as bragging rights. So that's cool. Nothing wrong with that. Hello, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. Let's start with a little story time. Now, anybody who has ever watched a single video from this channel knows that I work at a bookstore. And advanced copies of upcoming books are sent to the bookstore frequently and then left out for employees to choose from. So one day, I noticed there were some new books on the advanced copy shelf, and I was browsing when I came across this. James Patterson by James Patterson. Well, I'm not a Patterson fan, but I was curious. So I pulled it out and saw the cover of the ARC. I'm just going to share some of these with you. Nicholas Sparks calls this the life events that shaped an extraordinary man, compelling and fascinating. Patricia Cornwell, a tour de force that I recommend to everyone. At times, his poignant narrative will move you to tears. Admiral William H. McRaven, author of Make Your Bed, darling of conservative bros. A masterpiece, the most entertaining book I have read in the past 50 years. Hillary Rodham Clinton, the master storyteller of our times, a funny, poignant, triumphant journey. Ron Howard, the filmmaker, damn near addictive, I loved it. Stephen A. Schwartzman, co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Blackstone. Patterson's life is a thriller itself, a pure joy to read. Phil Knight, creator of Nike. The book is always entertaining. You will enjoy the read. And finally, Mike Lupica, famous for writing sports books and co-writing several with Patterson. First rule of storytelling is be there, and that's the genius of his autobiography. You're right there with him. Well, my first thought upon seeing this cover was that all of these luminaries can be wrong. And I want to find out in exactly what ways they are wrong about James Patterson's autobiography. So I made a life decision that I've been questioning ever since, and took the book home to read through it, research Patterson, and make a video about it. Thank you for being here. I wish I wasn't. So, before we really dig into this, I guess the first thing I should address is, why did I find it relevant to talk about James Patterson on my channel, especially since, as I've already stated, I'm not a fan. Why read this man's memoir? This isn't the kind of book I usually talk about, because I don't like them. Well, the thing about Patterson is you can't just ignore him. He's the top-selling author in the United States, and he outsells his next 3 competitors combined. He is the richest author in America, and he is the 3rd richest author in the world, ranked only after She Who Must Not Be Named, and a French philosopher who I assume must have family money. He has millions of fans who buy every book he writes, and no defenders amongst literary critics. In fact, he's drawn a lot of ire from the bookish community for a variety of sins, which I will be discussing toward the end of this video. There's, of course, the sin of being bad at writing, which honestly doesn't make me that angry. Lots of people are bad at writing. Lots of people enjoy bad writing. There are some types of bad writing that I enjoy very much. But the problem with Patterson is the way his business practices, for his authorship really is a business, that his business practices have affected writing, reading, and publishing. And these are things that people need to be aware of. Famously, one thing he does is co-write his books with what journalists have called a stable of co-writers, and then publish them still primarily under his name, as though it were more a brand than a mark of who actually wrote the book. This has been a really controversial practice within publishing, and we'll discuss it. But first, I want to look at the book itself. The reason I really picked this up is because I wanted to see what narrative a man like this crafts about himself, compare it to the truth, and, see if there was even anything to be learned. And if some of the quotations I share with you are also hilariously bad, and we get a few chuckles out of it, that's really the cherry on top. That's not what I'm here for. But some of it's really bad. What can I say? I didn't write it. Thank God. So, as you can see, I've marked several places where I was simply so astonished by the quality and content of the prose in this book that I felt moved to share with you. So, to sort of start us off, let's get a taste of what this book is like, and really give you something to work with, so that when we talk about this, it's not just me talking around this black hole of a book, but rather us diving into the black hole together, as a family. He starts off the book by talking about his childhood in a New York State town called Newburgh. So I looked up this town, and he talks a lot about having a kind of blue-collar background, very much a bootstraps narrative, which for a famous conservative American, yeah, I mean, you would kind of expect that. By the way, I don't say conservative as in Republican here. It's not widely known what his party affiliation, if any, actually is, and it does not matter. I mean conservative in terms of his ethos. Let me just read you a little conclusion here from the section of the book where he talks about his hometown. Before I take leave of my hometown, I have to say that, to this day, I look at the world through the lens of a blue-collar kid who grew up in Newburgh. It's a blessing. I think it's why I've never been too full of myself, too impressed with bestseller lists. It's probably why I'm kind of a working-class storyteller. I just keep chopping wood. So I looked up Newburgh. It's in Orange County, New York. Let's just say I've been to Orange County. I know someone whose second house is there. I'm not really getting a working class vibe. But let's say that we take him at face value. He talks about how his grandparents were working class, which, I mean, mine too, but we've been pretty privileged for a lot of decades in my family, and his description to me really reads like someone who's privileged but likes to give the illusion that the family has somehow earned its privileged position in society as a collective. This is something, I was recently speaking with my mom about this, actually. This is something that a lot of middle-class white families seem to do when they tell stories about their family history. I'm thinking of a friend I had who would talk all the time about how his grandma was raised in the Depression and that's why she's like that. And, you know, now we're fine, but she's got these little quirks from back when the family was just a plucky upstarts. And, I mean, a lot of people have got this, but it speaks more to how a family thinks about itself than to a family's actual position in society, and I find that this sort of thing really crops up a lot with people who have privilege and want to, even secondhand, through their relatives, feel like they've done something for it. But we haven't. That's not how privilege works. But okay, say we take him at his word. Say he really is from a working class background and he takes that blue collar attitude with him wherever he goes. Let's just see if that holds up. Oh, here's the next segment I had marked. And you'll see here, we're on page 51. So it's not like I went digging for this. Let me share. after Manhattan College, I got a full-ride PhD fellowship to study English at Vanderbilt. If you're wondering why, after that opportunity, he's not known as Dr. James Patterson. Well, he drew a lucky high draft number in the draft for Vietnam, and if he had stayed in school, he would have had to be re-entered in the draft the following year, so he dropped out to avoid being drafted. Now, I think the draft is monstrous, and I support all methods of draft dodging. Really, I do. I think that anything you can do to avoid being part of the military machine, and not everyone can avoid it. You know, some people, like Kurt Vonnegut says, are listless playthings of enormous forces, and they shouldn't be demonized for what they have to do to survive. But for God's sake, if you can avoid being involved in the military-industrial complex, do it at any cost. So, it's not the draft dodging that bothers me, but it's the way that he constantly writes characters who are cops and soldiers, that he works with soldiers, and, you know, really repeats a lot of jingoistic bullshit. It just rubs me the wrong way that he describes his draft dodging story with such breezy confidence that he'll then later use the same style to praise our brave men and women. Let's talk a little bit about his college and grad school years before we get any further into that. I'm really trying to hold back on any lecturing I'm tempted to do. It's just very hard with this book. It's absolutely fascinatingly terrible. Okay, here's a great description of the time he thought he had a black friend. There was a jazz bar a couple of blocks away on Amsterdam Avenue. Almost everybody who went to the bar was black. I obviously wasn't. But I got to be a regular. I was quiet, polite, and occasionally had a funny line for the bartender. The bartender is the black friend I think he thought he had. I'm sure the bartender found his jokes hilarious. So huge chunks of this book are just sort of decontextualized name dropping. Here he's talking about the time he met a radio personality named Jess Corman. I looked at the older guy and said, "Are you Jess Corman?" And he came right back with, "Why? Does he owe you money?" I started laughing, and ever since, whenever someone asks me, "Are you James Patterson?" I've been using that line. Why? Does he owe you money? He's just so profoundly uncreative. He just rolls through life like a snowball, picking up things that he thinks will be effective in mimicking the human experience, and then repeating them whenever necessary. He really does sound like one of those billionaire tech bros who don't know how to have a conversation. Only he's describing to us how he fakes the ability to connect with other humans. It's bizarre. I mean, he's really telling on himself here. I want to give you a sample here of just how absolutely profoundly boring most of this book is. And, you know, I'm not going to read too much of it because this was so boring I kind of forgot how to read for a page or two. But I just want to read you a couple sentences so you can get the idea of what the experience of this book is really like. In 1987, British marketing group WPP swooped in like a horde of harpies to buy J. Walter. Don Johnston was still chairman and CEO. He'd put on a couple of pounds, thank God. Threatened by WPP's tiny titan Martin Sorrell, who by purchasing competitors had expanded the I mean, the reason I don't work in marketing is because you literally couldn't pay me to listen to that. Here's more telling on himself. Let me tell you, life is pretty good for a best-selling writer. I think maybe I was born for this. And I still look at the world through the lens of a kid from Newburgh, New York. That helps me stay down to earth. Keeps things real, keeps me humble. Jimothy, sir, anybody would think they were born for a fulfilling, successful life if they were lucky enough to have access to it. Of course you feel like you're born for it. Everybody is born to do something that makes them happy and live in comfortable circumstances. Oh, love this. This is a really good encapsulation of why I could not have done what he did. He's talking about the publication of his first novel and meeting with his editor. He took me around the corner to a famous Boston restaurant, the Loch Ober Cafe. In the main dining room hung Mademoiselle Yvonne, a Tommaso Jugglari nude. Even in the 1970s, women could not sit at the bar, although they could eat in the restaurant. I thought it was a crazy rule, but I wasn't going to make a scene about it. Imagine you're this editor and you receive a manuscript from a woman and you're thinking, okay, so if I edit this, what's my week gonna look like? How am I gonna spend time with her? Well, I can't go to the bar. But James Patterson knew better than to make a fuss. He knew what side his bread was buttered on. Isn't he clever? Here's a whole chapter on a time his beach house burnt down, with no connection to any other incidents in the story or particular reason for it to be there. Again, most of this book is really dreadfully boring with occasional spikes of rage. There are a few moments that display genuine emotion. He talks about a time he was sexually assaulted by another ad man at one point, which he handles I don't know if I'd go so far as to say he handles it. I do feel bad for him, obviously, and I think he is trying to make a point about a culture of hierarchical abuse in the business world. But the thing is, he's afraid to say that there's hierarchical abuse in the business world because he was in charge of the creative team of this ad company for a number of years. And I think people would have follow-up questions. So he brushes by it in a really uncomfortable way. And then he also discusses the death of his first partner, who he was with for almost a decade before she died, I believe, of brain cancer, which is obviously heartbreaking, or ought to be, but he doesn't ever deviate from this breezy style he is committed to. There's no variation in the way things are talked about in this book, which means that he is not able to slow down for this poignant moment. There's no way to stop a third of the way through the book and suddenly give it the emotional weight it needs to earn the reader's empathy for such a heavy topic. It's really a shame he can't write. Okay, let's talk about something a little more fun. So Stephen King, famously, in an interview where he also blasted Stephanie Meyer, called James Patterson a terrible writer, which is objectively true. And Patterson never got over it. He mentions it several times in this book, and also in every interview that I've read of his. So in this chapter, well, let me just share. It's called The Murder of Stephen King. It starts off like this. I think the most useful, maybe even the most important thing I ever did in publishing wasn't as big a success as it might have been. I wrote or created the outlines for 73 book shots. We'll talk about book shots a little bit more in the next segment of the video. I have a few things to say. Book shots were novellas that sold for $4.99. My idea, my theory, my observation, was that a lot of people don't have the time to read 400 or 500-page novels or nonfiction books, but I wanted to keep them reading. So he's talking about his ideas for book shots, and one of the book shot novellas was called The Murder of Stephen King. It was a nice, twisty story. Believe it or not, Stephen King was the hero, the star, and spoiler alert, he doesn't get murdered. Okay. The Murder of Stephen King was a little wink from me to Uncle Stevie. I figured he could take a little good-natured ribbing. We're both small-town guys, right? No big egos. As a courtesy, the publisher at Little Brown let King's people know that the book was coming out. The King camp didn't like that. You can't do this. James shouldn't do this. This would be a terrible thing to do. Then Stephen King's representative hauled out the heavy artillery. Does James know that Tabitha King was actually threatened once inside their house by an intruder? I didn't know that, and I got the point. But shouldn't that mean that maybe Stephen King should stop writing his own scary stories if they were genuinely putting his family members in danger? I'm just saying. Anyway, out of respect, I decided not to publish The Murder of Stephen King. A cool story with Stephen King as the damn hero. Little Brown ate the entire print run, and nobody ever sent a note to say thanks. I still enjoy King's scary novels. The man can tell a story, but I guess he has trouble with thank you notes. I'm reading King's If It Bleeds right now, and I'm a little sorry to report that I'm liking it a lot. He's just such a self-centered, mean-spirited little man. Also, really, Jimothy, you liked If It Bleeds? Alright, so he writes very diffidently about his time spent with political figures, and as unpleasant as it is, and as much as it really does continue the pattern of shallow name-dropping in this book, I do feel the need to share some of this, because I want you to get an idea of the ideological core, or lack thereof, in this book. So we need to see how he thinks about these things. I am so sorry. Actually, I think I'm going to share this whole paragraph, because it's really something of Patterson's anti-manifesto. I try my best not to get political, especially when I'm interviewed on television. I'm not comfortable broadcasting any political or socioeconomic opinions, and I usually get itchy and twitchy watching other writers or actors getting up on I'm sorry. I didn't even notice that when I was underlining this. Does he think writer and actor are the same job somehow? You know what? I think some elements of that might get unpacked a little later, but for the most part, we're just going to leave that lie. I usually get itchy and twitchy watching other writers or actors getting up on soapboxes they don't always deserve to be standing on. I don't believe everything in life comes down to politics, but sometimes I feel like I'm one of the very few people thinking that way. I guess I consider myself an independent. I definitely want to hear what everybody has to say, both sides of the argument. Anyway. So this talks about a time that the Bushes invited him and his wife to be involved in a children's literacy event. He talks about how he got along with the Bushes and how he talked to the Clintons later and they said the Bushes were good people too, and they liked him, which... Alrighty then. Oh God. I have to read this to you too. I'm really sorry, but I don't think that I can do it justice by summarizing it. It seems to me there's a nasty little disease going around, and it's especially prevalent on TV and radio news shows. It goes something like this. My view of the world is right, and your view is stupid. I really don't like that. Honestly, it makes me a little sick to my stomach. Do I believe Al Franken should have had his Senate career ruined? My personal opinion? No. Do I know what went on between Woody Allen and the Pharaohs? Nope. And neither do you. And neither did the Hachette Book Group employees, none of whom had read Allen's autobiography apropos of nothing, when they demanded the publisher not publish it. Maybe I'm hopelessly old-fashioned, but I'm almost always on the side of free speech. This one's called Golfing with Presidents. I've played golf with 3 presidents, 41, 42, and 45. So he talks about having a nice time with George Bush and Bill Clinton, and he talks about how Donald Trump is the most serious, best golfer he's ever played with. And then to round out this little discussion of Jimothy's politics, I just want to share his description of an interview he did with Bill Clinton to promote a book they wrote together, The President is Missing. They did this with Craig Melvin on the Today Show. Almost before the director called out action, Craig Melvin launched into the subject of the Me Too movement. The president and I were prepared, but Melvin took a different tack. He asked President Clinton why he had never apologized to Monica Lewinsky. Well, obviously he had, multiple times. I'd seen it on national TV. The question upset the president, as I thought it should. He and Melvin were off, and definitely off the topic of The President is Missing. Now, since I was the president's wingman, I was trying to figure out how to stop this in mid-mess. My first thought, which I instantly vetoed, was to ask Craig Melvin if he wanted to talk about the Me Too using a more recent example, like NBC's own Matt Lauer's troubles. I hated that idea and knew the president would hate it too. Next, I considered standing up from my chair saying, "Time for a Coca-Cola break," and walking directly in front of the cameras. Not only would that stop the melee, but because I had used a product name, they probably wouldn't use the bite anywhere. Finally, I asked Craig Melvin if he wanted to go even farther back in history on the subject of presidents and Me Too issues. Lyndon Johnson? John Kennedy? FDR? How about Thomas Jefferson? That worked, but the damage had been done. I will never forget how nasty, how downright cruel it got during that book tour. I felt like I was in the middle of a firefight. Nobody was actually shooting at me, but it was still depressing and terrifying to be there as an unwilling eyewitness. You know what? Actually, I think we should talk about Thomas Jefferson. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about his children's literacy program. He talks a lot about how he thinks kids should read more and does everything he can to make that happen by writing what he believes are entertaining children's books, by donating to school libraries, by hosting a website that helps parents find books that might be high interest for their children to get them reading. All fine. I do believe him that he thinks children should read. He seems to be genuinely trying here, and that's good. But I do want to share a little bit from his chapter about children's literacy so that you can see just the way he constantly condescends to his reader. It's really astonishing. Unfortunately, there seems to be an unwritten prejudice against books and movies that make kids laugh. Some adults in positions of authority think, how serious can a book be if we're laughing at it? Pretty damn serious. Catch-22, anyone? Breakfast of Champions? A Confederacy of Dunces? Carry On, Jeeves? Diary of a Wimpy Kid? Those last two are not like the others. If they taught movies in school, and it wouldn't be such a terrible way to get kids thinking about structure and storytelling. My guy, they do teach movies in school now. But started with Ingmar Bergman movies, most of us would say, oh, I really don't like movies much. Okay, if you were going to use an example of high art that's hard to get into, why would you use a director whose work is as riveting as Ingmar Bergman's? Okay, so I've kind of gone through most of my tabs here. I think you're getting a really good idea of what this book is like, but I want to go back toward the beginning. We're in the first third of the book, or just starting the second third. And I want to share the moment that really was the most jaw-dropping for me in this book, in terms of his storytelling and what his priorities are and aren't. What he thinks is important context and what he thinks isn't. So he's at a New York literary party, and he spends the first page describing the location of the party and who he went with, people who aren't particularly important in literary history. Not to say that they have to be in the memoir, but just he doesn't really give any interesting, colorful details about them, and they don't reappear later in the book either. So, you know, they're divorced from context. And he describes entering a large bedroom at the party. The room was packed with people, noisy people, sweating people, tense people, fight fans. In the middle of the room stood these two small men. They were arguing loudly, fists clenched, looking like they were ready to rumble. The bedroom had become a pint-sized boxing ring. The men were Norman Mailer and James Baldwin. Two little guys who looked about as athletic as French poodles. Which, have you ever walked a poodle, my guy? Especially Baldwin. Homophobic. I remember that Mailer had actually done some prize fighting, but he didn't look like much of a fighter to me. The two men were squared off at center ring. Mailer and Baldwin were arguing about what should be considered good literature and what shouldn't. It seemed clear they weren't big fans of one another. Weird, because I was a fan of both of them, especially James Baldwin. You could not have dragged me out of that noisy, stuffy, overcrowded bedroom. No fisticuffs yet, but lots of heated words. The literary crowd gathered in the room was abuzz. The pugilists were circling, looking for an opportunity to pounce, maybe throw the first punch, but definitely win the war of words. I have to admit I found the whole thing hilarious. But I knew I would never forget that scene, and obviously I haven't. It set the tone for the absurdity of literary warfare, which I've tried my best to avoid. That's the end of that scene, which I've been puzzling over since I've read it, because he never describes the content of the argument between Mailer and Baldwin. Never quotes a single word from either of them or from any of the audience members who were abuzz with conversation about their argument. Never describes the outcome of the fight. Never connects Mailer and Baldwin to the literary context they existed in. He manages to tell what should be one of the most interesting literary anecdotes I've ever come across without containing any content. It's how can you read about a fight between two of the biggest literary figures of their time and not learn anything about either of the people or the literary culture of the time? It's absolutely baffling. And even if he doesn't remember anything they said or what they were arguing about, what does that say about his priorities, that he remembers their physiques, but not that? This was a hard book to get through to me, because it was by turns so boring and so insulting, and sometimes, like in that story, both at the same time. But I do want to say that when I actually sat down to start this book, I did try to read it with an open mind. I thought, while millions of fans absolutely can be wrong, it would be highly unlikely. And so I should try to see what people see in him. And I failed in that. I don't see what his supposed charm is. It simply doesn't work on me. So, part of that's my own failing. If you saw charm in some of these quotations, I'm not here to judge you for it. In fact, please describe your experience to me, because I don't get it. It doesn't click for me. This is one of the emptiest books I've ever read. It speaks of an impoverished worldview, and it feels unedited, because I can't imagine an editor who is responsible for the maintenance of Patterson's brand as a certain kind of author, reading this and letting it come out, letting him portray himself this way. It really seems like he's undercutting himself by showing just how profoundly shallow he really is. And I didn't expect this book to be particularly profound, of course. That's not its point. It's essentially a celebrity memoir. But if a celebrity memoir is a form of advertising or brand management, and I think in a lot of cases it is, certainly in this case, then it's poor advertising. Now, I'm going to start by pouring the warm water into the bowl. And then, the glue. Have you guys ever heard of self-plagiarism? Yeah, it's something grad schools really freak out about. Basically, you're not supposed to reuse a previous paper of yours and turn it in or publish it as a different paper of yours. That's why researchers cite themselves when they quote their own previous work, is to avoid self-plagiarism. And that's exactly what James Patterson doesn't do when he takes word-for-word quotations he's been using in interviews for a decade and republishes them as chapters of his memoir, which he plans to charge you, yes you, $30 for in hardcover. Now we're going to stir the mixture. And you can't see this because this isn't a real craft tutorial, but basically you want to thoroughly mix the water and the glue until they become what's essentially thin glue. Looks like milk but doesn't taste like it, as far as I know. Now, we're going to take our balloon and begin covering it. I'm just going to use the cover of this arc with its disgustingly fawning reviews from various non-writer celebrities as a base for this, because we are going to want the bottom of the skull to be flat here. Okay, so let's cover this up. So you're just going to dip the paper in it, and I don't know, much like you, I have not done this since elementary school, so what we're going to do now is hope for the best, which I think is also, incidentally, what James Patterson's co-writers do when they offer their work to him for a flat fee plus bonuses that he decides out of his own pocket. And apparently, now this is just a rumor, but that's only because no one involved is willing to confirm the truth, no royalties on his massive sales. Ever the businessman. You'll notice my hands are getting a little gluey, but I knew when I picked this book up that this was going to get messy. Oh, and here's the part that warns that it's an ARC and I'm not supposed to sell it. Don't worry, this skull won't be for sale. It's for my own personal collection. So, the traditional flower recipe is arguably a lot more fun than this, but the thing is, it can rot, and I want this memento on my bookshelf forever. As if to remind me not to put myself through this again. Mm-hmm. Do you know in the first ever ad for one of his books, and I mean television ad, because in 1992, the year of my birth, Patterson took out at his own expense a television ad in 4 major American cities advertising his first Alex Cross book, Along Came a Spider. The first line of this ad, which I couldn't find archived on the internet, if anyone's seen it, please, for the love of God, send it to me. The first line of this ad was, "You can stop waiting for the next Silence of the Lambs." I wasn't able to find any evidence on how Thomas Harris reacted to that claim. Thomas, if you're watching, please interact. Your books are pretty cool. I like how you made Dracula, but without magic. The vibe of making this is kind of like giving a balloon a massage. It's not unpleasant, but it's deeply bizarre. Or like backwards phrenology. Consumer writing, consumer fiction, doggerel verse, of the moment hot take essays have existed for as long as printing as commerce has existed. In fact, in Pope's Dunciad, yes, we're talking about the Dunciad again. Can take the girl out of the PhD program. In Pope's Dunciad, there's actually a scene where he uses imagery of the dunces being swept away in a deluge of pulp that floods the streets of London. In grad school, a colleague of mine wrote a rather good paper about what that said about Pope's fears about the publishing industry, commoners, and also capitalism. Rather lovely writing. I don't know if he ever published it, and I don't care because he was mean. It's about done here, and almost time to let it dry, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to make some little brow ridges on this guy, and I'm going to just move this around to the side in hopes that people will be able to see a bit better here. Now, I'm really thoroughly soaking these little guys, because honestly, this kind of fine detail should be done with paper mache pulp, but that's a whole separate recipe, and I am not that good a creator. I barely have the patience to let this dry and then go through the rest of the process of decorating it. These are brow ridges, but gonna be real, they're gonna look more like eyebrows. Good. We've got that. All right, that'll do it. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about how Patterson operates and his effect on the literary world. So I mentioned before that Patterson famously uses a huge number of co-authors. And the way this works, as he himself admits, and has admitted in several previous interviews, how he writes a 60 to 80 page outline, basically a very detailed play-by-play of all the scenes he wants and kind of what he wants the book to shape up as. And then essentially he sends it to somebody else who does the actual writing. These people are his personal employees, not the publishers. And the book is published usually as by James Patterson and whoever. You've seen that around, I'm sure. So it really is author as brand rather than author as writer. So he talks here about all of the famous pairs that really speak to the value of collaboration. And I think it's very telling, some of the things he compares to his co-writing system. Simon and Garfunkel, Lennon and McCartney, Gilbert and Sullivan, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Woodward and Bernstein, Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, Joel and Ethan Cohen, just some examples. All of which, with the arguable exception of Simon and Garfunkel, are pairs of talented people who work together to create something that they could not individually have created, and whose individual creations were qualitatively different from their product. Not an intellectual landlord and his exploited tenants. So then he goes on to go through a massive number of quotations he asked for from his co-writers, essentially testimonials as to the effectiveness of the system. And oh my god, no, we're totally not exploited. It's fine, this is fine, this is fine. In fact, he even describes it here. I asked a few of the co-conspirators, the ones smart enough to keep it civil, to share a few of their thoughts on whatever it is that we do together. I want to hear from the ones who weren't going to keep it civil, but I just want to share some of the things these co-writers say, because I do think they're quite revealing. Co-writer David Ellis, who works on thrillers with him, says, I always felt like Jim was doing more than collaborating with me. He was trying to teach me, and it was always about respecting the reader. Co-writer Brendan Dubois writes, Jim is a true collaborator, rarely telling you how to fix something, usually leaving it up to you to figure out. Co-writer Richard DeLallo, who also worked as an ad exec with Patterson. A really good thing about writing with Jim is that you feel he believes in you. He thinks you're good. That kind of respect is very empowering. You're free to be inventive, creative, surprising. He may not always agree with you, but you do feel that he was happy you went on the journey. It's a very interesting combination of paternalistic condescension and exploitative management practice that this man seems to be using. He really does give off boss vibes, doesn't he? I think it's interesting that these are the positive quotations he could get out of his co-writers, and a lot of these people are people who have names of their own and are actually known as authors, his most successful co-authors, in other words. I mean, I know it's hard to make a living as a writer, but I don't know. It just seems like a terrible job to me. So I was curious, because I got this impression that Patterson was a kind of intellectual landlord, and I wanted to see if there's anything bearing up how much of the writing he actually does, whereas how much is him exploiting other people's work as writers. And so I found an article in Digital Humanities Quarterly, and I'm going to link it and the other sources that I used for this video down below, where the authors studied quantitatively, using stylometric analysis, how much of the writing Patterson actually did. and the result was pretty predictable. Books co-written by Patterson and an author usually matched up stylistically with that author's solo work and not with Patterson's solo work. In other words, Patterson doesn't write the co-written books. And we pretty much knew this, but to me it was really important to have confirmation because this is something that the literary world has really been ragging on for a long time, and it would be super embarrassing if it wasn't true. But it is true. And I want to read some quotations here where the authors talk a little bit about the context of this kind of writing as a production line. They say, Patterson appropriates and manipulates the economic, social, and industrial forces which have shaped the form and content of the novel since its ascent in the 18th century. We can situate Patterson as working within structures of literary production indissociable from the capitalist forces which drive most literary production. His rediscovery and refinement of the novel's popular traditions is accompanied by a choice of style and subject matter that makes his works exemplary of the experience of leisure time in late capitalism. And they talk here about writers like Alexandre Dumas, who had a good number of writers he would essentially have write under his name so that he could dominate all the serialized publications at the same time, and ended up writing far more novels than one human could physically write because of it, and was excoriated in the press of his own time. They talk about writers like that and how this kind of commercialized novel writing has always existed. Now, because this is a scholarly article, they don't really take a stand on what that means, although they do say, which I think is rather pointed for an academic article, that he primarily assumes a managerial role in the creative process itself. So when they're talking about the experience of leisure time in capitalism, what they're talking about is a concept called commuter fiction. Basically the idea that propulsive page turners with extremely short chapters, like Patterson's, most of his chapters are like 2 or 3 pages, that these are specifically designed to be consumed in small amounts in heavily distracting environments, like on the subway on your way to work. That's commuter fiction. Fiction designed to be consumed in bites around the demanding schedule of late capitalism's workforce. Something that you can read while you're waiting for the bus or on a 15-minute break. We talked about book shots, these ideas, these $4.99, under 150 pages, basically bare bones thrillers he wanted to sell almost like periodicals. The tagline of the book shots on jamespatterson.com is actually, "Life goes fast, books should too." Kind of really boiling down consumer fiction to its barest, poorest essentials. And I think that so book shots as an idea pretty much failed within a couple of years, and there was a lot of hemming and hawing about why that might have happened at the time. But I think it was pretty obvious to all the bookish people who were around at the time, who were paying attention. It was because it said the quiet part loud. It was so crass in its admittance of what James Patterson's books were for. And nobody wanted to face that head on. There are feelings and stigmas associated with reading. No one wanted to feel like they were reading a bookshot, even if they had been called something different, something a little bit less on the nose. They might have done better, but I mean, they really said, this is for if you want to read without reading. Reading in the cultural sense of the word, the way people view readers. And of course that's a very weighted idea, and there's a lot wrong with that too. But, you know, people who think of themselves as serious readers didn't want to pick up a book that admitted that it wasn't that serious, and people who did read purely for the entertainment value didn't want to pick up a book that advertised to other people that they read purely for the entertainment value. I don't know. It's interesting. And I don't think that it's bad to read for entertainment value. I don't think it's bad to prefer plot over style. I don't. Personally, a book that puts plot over style often, not always, depends on the quality of the plot, bores me. But that's me, and I think that there should be all kinds of readers in the world. Otherwise, how would we talk to each other about books? We'd just be saying the same thing back and forth to each other. This is a call-out post at all colleges. So Patterson's idea wasn't necessarily bad. He just managed to market it in the worst way possible by admitting it was marketing. And I think that's the crux of Patterson as a figure in our society, in our literary landscape. I want to quote here from a New York Times article about the publishing industry's reaction to him. A number of former Little Brown employees who attended these sorts of meetings with Patterson in the 1990s and early 2000s described him to me as low-key but intimidating, more cutthroat ad man than retiring writer, a kind of real-life Don Draper. Unsatisfied with publishing's informal approach to marketing meetings, Patterson had expected corporate-style presentations, complete with comprehensive market share data and sales trends. Because his books are a product, and their status as a product matters more than what they bring to people, matters more than their content, and ultimately matters more than his presence. He really is on a lifelong journey to hollow himself out and exist only as a name that attracts money. And, well, it's not my vibe. That's for sure. Well, it's been a few days. The paper mache has dried. And now we have a skull to decorate. Now you'll see that it is now covered with gold tissue paper. I did this while it was still wet, only I forgot to film it because I almost forgot to do it. I wanted to pop the balloon on film. The problem being that my mother cannot be left alone in the house with an unfinished craft project or she will interfere. So she texted me while I was at work and asked if she could pop the balloon. And I said, yes, but you have to film it. So, there's your balloon popping footage. You're welcome. It's a little hard to see in the light with the shiny paper, but we do have some eyebrow ridges here. I put nose ridges in, but unfortunately I put them in upside down because I wasn't thinking. Because I haven't done paper mache in a very long time and I was panicking. So, it's just gonna kind of have upside down nose holes and we're gonna deal with that. I want to take this item made of the pulp of a disposable book and turn it into something that is a kind of heroic keepsake. So I am using photos from Paul Koudenaris' Heavenly Bodies for inspiration. These are bejeweled Roman skeletons from late antiquity. Here's a fascinating example. I'm really fond of these eyes that are jewels surrounded with seed pearls. So I obtained some tiny stick-on pearls and a 1-pound bag of fake jewels because that is the only size bag available at the craft store. We've also got some gold lace, some doilies to paint gold, and gold flakes and glitter. So we're going to apply these in layers to give it kind of an antiqued look, as if the skull had been gilded and then faded over the years. That is a little different from the kind of skulls I'm using as inspiration. Really, that inspiration is mostly for the jeweling patterns. So that's what we're doing. There we go. Now this is going to be a kind of mesh that the jewels and pearls go onto. Okay, so what we're going to do is glue these on to the eye holes here, and that's going to create a base for us to make the jeweled eyes. From a proud tradition of medieval artisans, all the way up to whatever the fuck this is. As you can see, now we are ready to surround the jewels with little pearls. Now what we're doing here is we're going to just pinch off one of these little guys, and we're gonna, there we go, like that. I am not going to make you watch this whole part. Here we have two slightly lopsided jeweled eyes. Now let's give them some eyebrows because we don't want to commit any crimes against catacomb fashion. If this were a real craft channel, then you'd actually be able to see what I'm doing. But this is not a craft channel. I don't know what the hell kind of channel this is. There we go. Two eyes with two eyebrows. Slightly quizzical. But then, if I were a skull in this situation, I think I would feel slightly quizzical as well. Alright, now we are going to make a little ribbon crown here. And it's going to kind of go across the skull like that. It's going to involve gluing on this folded ribbon and cursing a lot. So, let's get this going. Okay, well, so far this is suspiciously... there's the trick. Okay. Alrighty. Now I really can't show you anything I'm doing, because if I move this, I'm afraid everything will fall apart. Isn't that fun? Alright. I've made this franken-doily with a little teardrop jewel to glue onto the nose area in hopes of covering up my terrible nose ridge error of earlier. Not my best work, but I think it'll be passable. Let's mix up our glitter solution. Actually, first we want to just brush a little bit of gold paint into a few spots. Give it this multi-layered antiqued look. Oh, that's what happens when I try to move anything. Alright, we are not rotating the skull. Okay, now let's mix up the gold glitter solution here, and we will use it to apply some of these gold flakes. So I pour some gloss medium into a tray. This is usually used to mix pigments for paints, but I use it almost exclusively to create glitter glazes because I'm a monster. Now I'm going to start with the back of the skull, both so you can see and so I can figure out what I'm doing. So let's just, we'll apply a tad here. Oh, look at that. Then we'll take some of these gold foil bits and, whoop. Oh, these are a weird texture, you guys. There we go. Sticks right on there. In the morning, in the evening, ain't we got fun? Ooh, fun. Imperial Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth, which kept the world in awe, should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw. Ashes to ashes, pulp to pulp. Well, this is the final product. Isn't she lovely? If this isn't proof that something beautiful can be made from, what the fuck am I talking about? I don't believe that shit.